My name is Luna, and when I say it, it feels like I'm reaching for a light that never quite reaches the ground, like I'm trying to reflect something that's always just a little bit further than an outstretched arm. I'm 34 years old, an environmental engineer accustomed to calculations, to the purity of formulas, to the orderliness of data, and perhaps that's why the chaos of that evening tore me apart, as if someone had suddenly yanked all my familiar coordinates out from under my feet. It was a typical Sunday dinner at my parents' house. The smell of roast meat, the soft glow of the lamp over the table setting that my mother always tried to keep uniform, as if the family's peace depended on it. But that evening, everything fell apart, and the air in the living room became so thick you could cut bread with it. We were all sitting at the table, my father, my brother Nathan and his wife, my mother, who tried to smile even though the corners of her lips trembled, and me. The roast had cooled and sat frozen in the middle of the table, untouched, as if it knew no one cared about food that day. As my father leaned forward, his voice, usually hoarse, suddenly became icy, smooth, as if chiseled from steel. "You can take the guest room or move out." His gaze was fixed on me, unblinking, unwavering, and in that moment, for the first time, I realized that the rift between us wasn't just a fight, but a real rift. And before we continue, I want to thank you. I'm so glad you're watching this video on my channel. Please let me know in the comments if you hear stories like this and remember someone in your life. Maybe yourself, someone close, or just a moment when everything suddenly changed. Write down the first thing that came to mind. Nathan jumped up almost instantly, and his voice rang with glee, that small, caustic triumph that comes from someone certain they've won. "It's better if you're gone tomorrow." I felt my fork slip from my hand and clink against my plate, the sound seeming to split the evening in half. Everything I'd paid, all the bills, the repairs, the new refrigerator, the roof sheathing, it all surfaced in my head in the form of dry numbers, receipts, invoices. I'd covered most of the expenses, I'd carried this house, but now they were treating me like an unnecessary structural element, discarded for the sake of symmetry. My brother's wife leaned forward slightly, smirked, her eyes lit up like those of someone finally receiving confirmation of her authority. She looked like this was her triumph, and in that moment, I felt a wave of humiliation wash over me. I tried to speak, tried to argue, my voice trembling, breaking. I listed every detail, every dollar spent, but my father merely waved me off. "It's decided," and there was something in his movement, as if he were wiping dust from the table, light, indifferent, as if erasing me from his memory. Mom was silent, looking at her plate, and I saw her fingers, always calm, tremble. Somewhere in my chest, rage flared, sharp as a burn, and in that moment I realized that staying here would be a betrayal of myself. I stood up, the chair creaked, grabbed my keys, and said, looking at my father, "Okay, I'm leaving," and I left without turning around, my legs numb, as if the floor had dissolved. That same night, I packed up everything I could, the TV, the sofa, the coffee maker, even the old floral blanket my mother had once given me, and left the place I'd called home for years. A week later, when I'd already begun to piece my life back together, renting a tiny apartment, buying a new kettle, getting used to the silence without my parents' footsteps, the phone vibrated. It was my mother. Her voice was taut as a thin wire. Luna. Nathan's screams echoed in the background, harsh and desperate. "She's lying," he screamed. "Mom, tell me she's lying." I stood by the window, listening to the chaos spilling out of the receiver, as if the storm from the old house had suddenly reached me, even here. I didn't know what exactly had happened, but I felt it. The crack that had appeared at the table had now become an abyss, and what happened next turned not only their world upside down, but mine as well. But before I continue, I'm strangely curious. What time is it where you're listening to this, and what city are you in? Sometimes I wonder how far my story has traveled, who it resonates with, who perhaps hears their own pain in it. Many years ago, I returned to my parents' house to help them deal with things my father had long since stopped noticing: bills, a leaky roof, a broken washing machine. My grandmother had once paid off the debts, but my father seemed unwilling to admit that the house was alive only because his women cared. I, an environmental engineer accustomed to saving rivers and soil, was now saving this house, paying for new windows, a water heater, and light fixtures. I worked 60 hours a week, visiting sites during the day, writing reports at night, but it wasn't enough. Dad nodded, taking the receipts from my hands, but his eyes always gravitated to his brother. Nathan was a survivor, always coming up with a new idea: food trucks, crypto apps, an online store that collapsed after 3 months. But Dad always greeted him with the words, "Now that's a real entrepreneur." And my work seemed to dissolve, invisible. One day, Mom whispered, "She's here to help. Nathan has big dreams." And I realized, in their world, I was a tenant, not a daughter. Then Nathan met his wife. I remember that evening. He walked in with a radiant woman, wearing an expensive watch and shiny shoes, and introduced her as a real estate agent. My mom and dad admired her, laughed, and said how smart she was, and I watched her park her black SUV at the gate and thought, there's too much gloss in this picture, too little truth. As usual, I tried to keep the conversation going, asking her how things were going with the properties and what clients she was working with. But she smiled as if I'd asked something awkward and steered the conversation into a vague story about some complicated deal she was supposedly about to close. Her voice was confident, almost brazen, the kind of confidence one gets from people accustomed to admiring listeners. At the time, I wasn't sure what was bothering me, her manner of speaking or the way Nathan hung on every word, his expression filled with admiration, as if every remark were a prophecy. Gradually, I began to notice other little things I'd have missed if I hadn't been paying attention. She'd stop by my place with purchases from stores I wouldn't have set foot in, even working overtime. She'd always had new bags, shoes, and jewelry, and she'd always say it casually, as if it weren't a luxury for her, just background noise. Once, I remember, she pulled a brand new phone out of its box, the very one I'd only read about in an ad, and, grinning, said it was a business expense. Nathan didn't even blink, he just chuckled approvingly and added that she had a natural talent for turning everything into success. Dad patted him on the shoulder and said with a satisfied expression, "You chose the right woman." I bit my tongue, but something inside me clenched, because math is math, you can't explain love or infatuation with it. I knew how much life cost. I knew that my salary had long been spent not on dreams, but on bills and taxes, on the roof they lived under, and yet she was throwing money around as if it fell from the sky. One day, I couldn't resist pouring Mom some tea and asking if she thought Nathan and his wife had such different perspectives on reality, that maybe she should at least ask where it all came from. Mom sighed, shrugged, and said, "She's just successful, Luna, don't be so skeptical." Her voice sounded tired, as if she was trying not to think, lest she disturb the balance that was already hanging by a thread. But it wasn't just about money. She had a way of speaking, as if every word was meant to convince someone. She even sold the air around her, a little too smoothly, a little too carefully. When she started talking about house flipping, deals, and interest rates, she avoided dry terms like equity and leverage. But as soon as she mentioned anything about profit, Dad's eyes lit up, and Nathan nodded, as if fascinated. I tried to intervene, gently reminding her that I'd recently paid property taxes, that everything in this house depended on regular payments. But my father, without looking at me, would say, "Let's not get distracted, let her talk about her project." And again, I became invisible, existing only when something needed to be paid. One day at dinner, I caught a brief smirk on my daughter-in-law's face, as subtle as a shadow, but so eloquent. There was something like victory in her gaze, as if she knew she'd fooled us, and no one even cared. The worst part wasn't that, but how life had changed outside of those moments. Nathan started borrowing my car without even asking, throwing out a casual, "I need it for a meeting." My father increasingly asked me to help with the house, even though I was already running the household, paying bills, and doing minor repairs. Mom was silent. She stood at the sink, washing dishes, as if she were dissolving in her own movements, and avoided my gaze, as if she understood, but could not intervene. I started counting in my head, all the years, all the money I'd invested, hundreds of thousands. I wasn't just helping, I was carrying this house, and now I realized, for them, I was a backup plan, the one who would always back them up while Nathan and his wife were shining. I lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling of my old childhood room, where faded photographs still hung on the wall, and wondered why my work meant nothing, why I ended up playing second fiddle to my own family. I recalled the projects I'd given up for my parents, the weekends spent fixing pipes instead of relaxing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that behind Nathan's wife's brilliant smile lay something else, some kind of gamble, too risky to go unpunished. That evening, I walked into the dining room, which smelled of stewed meat and bay leaves, where my mother's old china sparkled in the chandelier. I slid into my usual seat, forcing a smile. Dad was cutting meat, Mom was laying out napkins, but her hands were visibly shaking, and then the front door swung open with a bang. Nathan stumbled into the house, dragging 2 suitcases behind him, his wife following close behind, with that same designer bag over her shoulder that had made my heart clench. "We're moving," he said loudly, throwing the suitcases on the floor. She stood nearby, smiling tensely, her heels clicking on the parquet floor like a victory march. My stomach clenched. This wasn't a visit, it was an invasion. Dad wasn't surprised. Didn't even look up from his plate, he simply said, in the same cold, even voice, "Luna, you can have the guest room or move out." I froze, my fork hanging in midair. "What?" I choked out, feeling something tearing in my chest. Nathan grinned, leaned back in his chair, and said, "Come on, Luna, you don't need that much space, we're starting a new life." His wife nodded, slowly looking around the room, and I could see the renovation plan already forming in her eyes, as if she were mentally trying out wallpaper on the walls where photos of our family still hung. I felt a heat rise inside me, as if all the years of resentment, buried deep, had finally burst forth, swirling somewhere beneath my heart and turning into a heavy, burning breath. "Wait," I blurted out, sharper than I'd intended, "I'm paying for this house. I paid the electricity, the mortgage, bought the refrigerator, the water heater, even the paint on these walls, and now you want me to sleep on a cot?" I turned to my father, hoping for at least a hint of sympathy, a look that would tell me I wasn't crazy, but he only sighed, long, tiredly, as if he was explaining the obvious again. "It's time for you to step away," he said evenly, not looking at me. "Nathan and his wife need this room more, they have plans." Plans, the word echoed in my head like a taunt. What plans? Nathan's plans never lasted longer than a season. Nathan's plans were me working nights so he could start over with a clean slate. I felt my fingers tremble, but I held myself together. Plans? I breathed. What plans, Dad? Another food truck? Another miracle app? Nathan leaned forward, and his smile spread, growing wider, colder. "You're not really needed here, Luna," he said, in that tone that made you want to wash your hands. "You're just here." His wife quietly stifled a laugh, covering her lips with a manicured hand, and a hint of satisfaction flickered in her gaze. Victory was hers. I clenched my fists under the table, feeling my nails dig into my palms. "Not necessarily," I said, my voice low but firm. "I invested hundreds of thousands so you could have this roof over your head. I gave up a promotion, a vacation, to fix this house, to keep everything together. What have you done, Nathan? What have you ever done besides take?" My voice wavered, but I didn't care anymore. I was tired of being a shadow in my own home. My father slammed his palm down on the table, shaking the glasses, and the sound resonated through me like a blow. "Enough," he barked. "This isn't about you, Luna, they're family, and they're staying." End of discussion. Mom, as always, sat next to me, her eyes downcast, fiddling with her napkin. I looked at her, silently begging for at least a look, a word, something that would confirm I wasn't going crazy, but she just sat there, speechless, like part of the furniture. Nathan's wife leaned slightly toward him and whispered something. I couldn't hear the words, but his smile said enough. In that moment, it seemed as if the walls of the room drew closer, the air grew thick, and the ceiling sank. I abruptly pushed back my chair, its creak echoing through the silence. "I won't do this," I said, standing up. "If I'm not needed here, I'll leave." I ran upstairs, my heart pounding as if it were chasing me. In my room, I grabbed my duffel bag and threw in my clothes, laptop, and a few books. Everything happened automatically, as if I'd been rehearsing this exit for years. Then I went downstairs, unplugged the TV, the same one I'd bought last year, and carefully dragged the sofa cushions I'd paid for toward the door. Nathan stood by the wall, watching, and laughingly said, "You're taking the couch? Seriously?" I remained silent. He came closer and leaned over, but I turned my back and continued walking, ignoring every sound of his mockery. As I carried the boxes out, my father was already standing in the doorway, arms crossed. "You're making a scene," he said evenly, and his calm hurt me even more than his screaming. I didn't respond. I simply loaded the last box, slammed the trunk, and started the engine. In the rearview mirror, the house slowly grew smaller, losing its outline, as if dissolving into the night. I wasn't just leaving the room, I was unloading the entire burden I'd been carrying for so long. A few days later, I was living in a small apartment downtown, a one-room apartment, modest, but my own. The city hummed outside, buses honked, dogs barked somewhere, and it all seemed alive after the stifling silence of my parents' house. My colleague Alicia managed to find an ad for a small but cozy apartment overlooking the street, where they sold coffee directly from a kiosk. That evening, she came over with a bottle of wine and pizza, and her laughter filled the empty living room. We unpacked boxes, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. "You need to get everything out of your head, Luna," she said, tossing me a flyer with the words yoga and harmony on a blue background. "It's not just stretching, it's a reboot." I chuckled, but inside, I felt the ice break a little. I went the next evening anyway, not for the stretching, but for the silence. To hear myself, I felt awkward, my body resisted, my muscles tensed, but by the end of the class, for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could let go, even for a minute. Alicia became my anchor, kind, calm, confident. She didn't ask unnecessary questions, she was simply there, and that was enough. And yet, the anxiety didn't go away. It returned at night, when I thought of my brother's wife's face, her pretentious confidence, her designer bags, her shiny SUV. Everything about her screamed ostentatious success, and the more I tried not to think about her, the more I sensed that something was wrong behind that shiny exterior. I decided to dig deeper, because something about this story was nagging at me, like a shadow standing in the corner of the room, silently watching my every move. I called Liam, an old real estate colleague I'd met at a conference where people talked about square footage with such passion, as if they were discussing the fate of the world. He answered the second time, and his voice, even, calm, but with a hint of surprise, immediately transported me back to the past. "Luna, we haven't heard from you in a while. How are you?" he said. I didn't waste time on pleasantries and asked him point blank if he knew anything about my brother's wife, Beatrice. I described her habit of speaking loudly and confidently, as if every deal she made brought a golden shower, her ostentatious wealth, her constant talk of money and clients, as if she were doing favors for them, not jobs. Liam paused for a moment, and I heard him take a breath, that short breath that usually follows something important. "Beatrice Rossi," he clarified. "If it's her, then, Luna, I'll be honest. Her name has come up more than once. Several agencies are monitoring her firm. There are rumors of shady resales, fake real estate appraisals, and even mentions of embezzlement of client funds. Nothing has been proven yet, but the smell there, let's say, is not pleasant." I felt a tightening in my chest, as if someone had suddenly snatched the air from me. After thanking Liam, I sat for a long time with the phone in my hand, trying to process what I'd just heard. If Beatrice really was part of something illegal, then my family was involved far deeper than I could have imagined. I dialed my father's number. When he answered, I immediately began, "Dad, you need to hear this. I found out about Beatrice's firm, and it's serious," but all I got in response was a short, irritated laugh. "Don't poke your nose into their business, Luna," he said, as if I were a teenager again, arguing over trivial matters. "They have everything under control." I tried to explain that it wasn't a family dispute, but a possible investigation, but he cut me off. "Enough, focus on your life," and he hung up. I stared at the phone screen, feeling irritation spread through my body, thick and sticky like tar. My father's blind trust in Nathan and his wife had always driven me crazy, but now it felt not just offensive, but dangerous. He'd chosen Nathan's side again, without even bothering to listen to me. Then I decided to call my mother, at least someone had to hear me. "Mom, please, just listen," I began quietly, trying to keep my voice even. I told her everything I'd learned, the rumors, the forged documents, the possible schemes. There was silence on the other end of the line, and only a few seconds later did I hear her sigh, quiet but firm. "Luna, let it go," she said. "They're happy, don't ruin it." Her words were like ice water, as if I was trying to knock on a wall. I wanted to scream, to shake her, to force her to see that beneath the surface of their happiness there might be trouble, but I knew arguing was pointless. My mother never challenged my father, never. I hung up, and a feeling of loneliness washed over me so suddenly that I could barely keep from crying, but within that pain, a resolve was born: if no one helped, I would find the truth myself. I started writing to old acquaintances, remembering anyone who might know something. A former client of my engineering firm now worked for a real estate law firm. I wrote her a letter, cautiously asking if she'd heard of Beatrice Rossi. The answer came quickly: the firm was indeed involved in mortgage fraud. Another acquaintance, a property registration expert, told me there was a rumor circulating in their circles that Beatrice was involved in great transactions, siphoning off money through fictitious resales. Every new bit of information weighed heavily on my heart. I no longer just suspected, I knew this woman was hiding something. I carefully compiled all the information into a mental file, mentally constructing a chain, like a thread leading deeper into a labyrinth. Late that night, I opened the public records website and began searching. Several properties were indeed registered in Beatrice's name, expensive homes sold at inflated prices to people who later filed lawsuits. It wasn't proof, but it was enough to understand. The smell of trouble was growing. I wrote to Liam again, asking him to let me know if he heard anything new. He replied almost immediately, "I'll keep an eye out. Take care, Luna." These words unexpectedly warmed me. They conveyed a concern I hadn't heard from my family in so long. Meanwhile, I continued living my new life: yoga classes, walks with Alicia after work, quiet evenings with a glass of wine and a book by the window. The city was gradually becoming my refuge, and yet, when the street noise died down, my thoughts returned to my family. The feeling of alienation lingered, as if somewhere behind me lay not just a grudge, but an entire story begging to be continued. I caught myself wanting to understand not only what Beatrice was planning, but also how deeply Nathan was involved. Was he an accomplice or just a pawn, led by a beautiful woman with icy eyes? 2 weeks passed, when in one of the small cafes, smelling of fresh pastries and cinnamon, I unexpectedly saw Sophie, an old family friend. She was sitting by the window with a cup of coffee, her gray hair pulled back into a neat bun, her eyes still shining with softness. "Luna," she said, noticing me, "it's been so many years. Come and tell me how you are." Sophie and I didn't talk for long, but as soon as I mentioned Nathan's wife's name, her smile instantly vanished, as if I'd uttered not a name but a spell, awakening a long-buried fear. "Beatrice Rossi?" she asked quietly, her voice wary, almost a whisper. "I knew her years ago. She worked for a real estate firm in Lincoln. It was a shady company, with a bad reputation. They were always up to something shady. They were sued for forging clients' signatures, for inflating property appraisals. To pocket the difference, Beatrice was deeply involved back then, but somehow she got out of it, as if she had a whole set of cards up her sleeve." Her words sent a chill through me. These weren't just rumors, not idle guesses. This was the missing piece of the puzzle I was chasing like a truth hunter. My heart was pounding in my throat, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. Before I knew it, I was behind the wheel, heading toward my parents' house. The road, familiar down to every bend, seemed endless. The air in the car was thick, like before a thunderstorm, and the closer I got, the faster my pulse pounded beneath my skin. Nathan stood in the driveway, unloading bags from the car. He had the same look, a smug smile, the confidence in his every movement, as if the whole world were orchestrated to his stride. I got out of the car without even saying hello. "We need to talk," I said abruptly, pulling out my phone. He turned to me, a look of irritated boredom flashing in his eyes, like someone interrupted by more important matters. I opened the email from Liam and handed him the screen. "Look, it's about Beatrice. She's not who she says she is. Her firm has been defrauding people for years, fake appraisals, stolen funds, lawsuits, and Sophie just told me Beatrice was involved in a scam in Lincoln. Nathan frowned, snatched the phone from my hands, skimmed the email, and, as soon as he finished, handed it back, as if I'd handed him not evidence but a blank sheet of paper. "You're just jealous, Luna," he said coldly, without even raising his voice. "Beatrice has achieved success, and you can't stand it. Stop making things up." I felt as if I'd been struck. "This isn't about me," I breathed out, feeling my voice tremble. "This is about your safety. She's dragged our family into a dangerous game." But he only chuckled, a sharp, prickly laugh that made my insides twist. "If you want to play detective, play somewhere else, just not here." I walked around him and entered the house. Mama was standing in the kitchen, stirring soup, the same thick, homemade one, with the aroma of bay leaves and something achingly familiar. "Mama," I said, containing my excitement. "Sophie knew Beatrice even before I told her name. She told me Beatrice worked for a company that was scamming people. You should check out what she's doing with the house." The spoon in my mother's hand hovered over the saucepan, but she didn't look up. "Luna," she said quietly, almost wearily, "don't make a fuss. Nathan is happy, that's all that matters." Her words were like a cold wall against which I pressed my forehead. I wanted to grab her hands, force her to look at me, but I knew she wouldn't change. My mother always stayed out of trouble, always left me to fight it alone. When I got home, I called Liam. My voice was tense, as if I was clutching a stone in my throat. "Sophie confirmed it," I said. "Beatrice really did work for that crooked company in Lincoln. Any news?" There was a pause on the other end, and I heard him sigh deeply. "Luna, after our conversation, I dug deeper. Her name is on the mortgage deed for your parents' house, signed last month. This mortgage is held through a shell company connected to the same network as Beatrice's old company. If this is as I think it is, your parents could lose the house." The world rocked. I caught my breath. The house I'd fought for years, invested every penny I had, every sleepless night, into, was now in someone else's hands, a pawn in someone's cynical game. "Send me the documents," I asked, my fingers shaking as I hung up. The next hours passed in a blur. I sat in front of my laptop, clicking one link after another, checking public records, and with each new document I found, I felt a knot tighten in my chest. The mortgage was real, a huge loan, a six-figure sum, with my parents' house as collateral. My father's signature stood next to Beatrice's. Not a single signature from my mother, not a single mention of me. Another entry, a transfer from my parents' savings account to a checking account linked to Beatrice's agency. This wasn't just a scam anymore, it had become personal. She had exploited my family's trust to fleece them to the last penny, and they trusted her more than me. Every conversation with my father, every hope my mother had shattered by her silence, now echoed in me with the pain of betrayal. They had chosen Beatrice and Nathan, and now they were trapped. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. The weight of all the years, all the unspoken things, everything I had done for them to keep them from drowning, now fell upon me completely. But along with the pain came something else, a steely calm. I wasn't going to back down. Beatrice thought she could play anyone, that she could charm and confuse, hide behind smiles and new outfits, but I saw right through her from the start. I opened a folder on my computer and began collecting everything, every document, every letter, every piece of evidence. It wasn't just about the house anymore, it was a matter of principle. I had to show her that her smooth acting was over, that I saw her true face, and that she wouldn't run away from me, no matter how fast she ran. One evening, when work had dragged on again, and I was sitting tired in my apartment, surrounded by papers, spreadsheets, and notes that had long since merged into one gray ribbon of everyday life, my phone suddenly vibrated on the table. Mom appeared on the screen. I almost didn't want to pick it up, after everything that had happened, after the endless reproaches and the walls of silence between us. But something stabbed in my chest, and I answered. Her voice was strange, trembling, as if there was a wind behind her, and she whispered, trying not to give herself away. "Luna, there are people," she said hoarsely, "they're asking for Beatrice." And that was enough to make everything inside me collapse. I grabbed the keys without even turning off the light, and, beside myself, I rushed to my parents' house. feeling the blood pounding in my temples, like every second felt like an eternity. When I pulled up, two men in suits were already standing in the driveway, their badges gleaming dully in the streetlight, reflecting off the wet asphalt. The air was tense. My father stood by the door, his face chalk white, and next to him, slightly behind him, Nathan was pacing, clutching his phone as if it held his last hope. One of the investigators turned to me, looking straight ahead and calm. "We're talking about some real estate transactions. We need to talk to Beatrice Rossi. She's involved in a case involving fraud, forged documents, and embezzlement." I didn't answer. I simply stood there, staring at Nathan. He paled, and something wild and animalistic flashed in his gaze. "She's lying," he suddenly cried out, as if defending not only her but himself as well. "Mom, tell me she's lying." Mom froze in the hallway, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her sweater, her lips trembling, but she didn't say a word. The investigators continued calmly, as if reading from a piece of paper. "Ms. Rossi used Mr. Nathan's name in a number of questionable transactions, including a loan secured by this house." I saw Mom shake her head, as if trying to shake off a bad dream. My father stepped forward, his voice trembling. "She's not here right now," he said, looking off to the side. The investigator handed him a business card, dryly saying they'd be back, and headed for the car. I was standing by the gate when I noticed a black car across the street. The headlights were out, but I recognized her. Beatrice. She was sitting behind the wheel, peering into the house, and didn't seem to notice me. I crossed the street. My phone was already in my pocket, recording. "Beatrice?" I called, my voice surprisingly calm, even though everything inside was seething like a volcano. She flinched and turned around, her eyes flashed, her lips pressed into a line. "What happened, Luna?" she asked coldly, with that same note of irritation that always betrays fear. I stepped closer. "I know everything," I said calmly, "about the mortgage, about my parents' account, about those deals you carried out through shell companies. You devastated my family. Stop lying, tell me the truth." She was silent for a moment, then smiled, but it was crooked. "Fine," she said sharply, looking me straight in the eye. "I took the money. The house was collateral for the deal your father signed." Nathan, as always, didn't understand. He's too naive to notice. I clutched the phone in my hand a little tighter, not allowing my emotions to spill out. "You used them," I said. Her eyes flashed, and a shameless, almost predatory grin appeared on her face. "They trusted me. It's their fault." Before I could respond, she abruptly lunged for the car. The doors slammed, the engine roared, the tires screeched on the gravel, and she disappeared into the darkness. I stood in the middle of the street, watching her go, and only now realized how hard it had become to breathe. That admission, her calm, brazen admission, was stronger than any blow. She drove away, leaving us to clean up the mess she'd created, as if it were possible to walk away, erasing ruined lives. When I returned to the house, Nathan was sitting on the living room floor, hunched over, his hands clutching his hair, his eyes dull. "How could she do that?" he muttered, barely looking at me. "You knew, Luna, you knew something was wrong. Why didn't you stop her?" I looked at him for a long time, then slowly answered, "I tried. You called me jealous, you all shut me out, even Mom." She stood against the wall, not saying a word, and her silence sounded louder than any scream. My father sat down at the table, placed the investigator's papers in front of him, the loans, the transfers, the signatures I'd warned them about. He looked at them as if they were a death sentence, and then quietly exhaled. Then came the evening, long, viscous. I was sitting at home when the phone rang again. "Dad," I heard, his voice broken like an old branch. "Luna, we're in trouble. The bank is demanding repayment of the loan. We could lose the house. Can you come? We need your help." I closed my eyes. Years flashed before me, bills I'd paid, renovations I'd tackled alone, those family dinners where I'd been pushed away from the table because I was being too hands-on. Everything I'd invested, everything I'd given away, came back like an echo. "No, Dad," I said firmly, "I gave everything for this house, and you chose Nathan and Beatrice over me. Now it's up to you." He tried to say something, faltering mid-sentence, but I hung up. And for the first time in a long time, the air in the room felt light. Freedom smelled strange, bitter, dusty, but also new. It was as if I had thrown off an invisible chain. The one that had been holding me back all these years, and for the first time I allowed myself to simply be. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, feeling as if the night had been just a brief respite before something heavy and inevitable. The air felt thick, as if saturated with the shadow of yesterday's conversations. I was pouring myself a coffee when my gaze fell on the phone again, the recording, the one where Beatrice's voice, cold, confident, without a trace of remorse, uttered the words that now sounded like a death sentence. I played it again, listening to how calmly, almost defiantly, she confessed to her machinations. Not a tremor, not a doubt. I kept the recording, knowing that sooner or later the investigators would want to hear it, and that cold voice was now not just evidence, but a boundary dividing the past from what was yet to be lived through. I understood that Nathan and his parents were now left alone to face the consequences. The house, their pride, our family fortress, was threatened, like a ship taking on too much water. Their trust in Beatrice had crumbled, and what had recently seemed like salvation had become their downfall. I did everything I could, warned, fought, explained, but they hadn't chosen me, and I had no intention of returning to mend their mistakes again. Nevertheless, I went to their place in the morning. I needed to see what was left. The front yard greeted me with a resounding silence, no birdsong, no familiar creak of the gate, only the frozen light of the lantern, still burning from the night before. The house reeked of anxiety. Papers lay scattered across the table, as if after a storm, bank statements, loan agreements, notices stamped in red, delinquency. I sat down next to my father, and he silently handed me a bank folder. The numbers inside weren't just terrifying, they were incomprehensible. A second mortgage on the house, $250,000, signed by him and Beatrice, without a single payment. Their savings account, which had once held retirement funds, about $200,000, was empty. Everything had been transferred to an account linked to Beatrice's company. I automatically began following the chain of transactions, habitually engaging the engineer in me, the person accustomed to cobbling together a system from the rubble. But the more I peered at the numbers, the more clearly I realized, this wasn't just a mistake, it was a catastrophe. The house I had once maintained, saved from destruction, was now a bottomless vortex, dragging everyone down. Nathan sat hunched over on the couch, his eyes red, his face etched with the marks of a sleepless night. "Luna, you have to help us," he said, his voice shaking, as if each word was forced. "The bank will come for everything. We're ruined." I looked at him and suddenly remembered that evening, their dinner, their laughter, his condescending gaze when I tried to warn him. "Help you?" I repeated quietly, but the warmth remained in my voice. "You called me jealous. Dad said it was time for me to move out. I left, and now you want me to fix it?" He looked away, but he didn't give in. "We're family," he whispered. "You can't just leave." I shook my head. "You made your choice, and I made mine." My father stood by the window, hunched over, like a man who had suddenly aged 10 years. His voice was hollow. "I screwed up, Luna. I trusted her. I thought Nathan was in control. I was wrong." His confession cut deep, but it couldn't break down the wall I'd been building for years. "You weren't just wrong, Dad," I said slowly. "You chose her over me. You chose Nathan's dream over my reality, and now I can't fix it." He looked at me, his gaze full of pleading, but I no longer responded. I had already given too much time, nerves, love, to dive into the same abyss again. At that moment, Mom entered the room. Her face was tear-stained, her eyes were red, her hands were shaking. "Luna, please," she said in a hoarse, almost childish voice, "we're going to lose everything. The house, our savings, everything is gone." She reached for my hand, but I stepped back. I saw in her gaze not only fear, but also that same shadow of silence that had stood between us for so many years. "You didn't listen, Mom," I said quietly, but clearly. "I tried to tell you about Beatrice, but you told me to forget. You said they were happy, and now you're asking me to save you." Mom covered her face with her hands and began to cry, heavily, silently, and in those tears, strangely enough, there was no cleansing, only belated remorse. I felt a pang of guilt, brief, almost physical, but it quickly dissolved into emptiness. It had all gone too far. I walked through the house as if it were a museum of my own efforts. The new windows I'd ordered and paid for, the refrigerator bought the winter their old one burned out, the walls I'd painted when they were sick, everything I'd touched out of love was now threatened, not by time, but by the greed of a stranger and my blind faith in her. I looked up at the papers, where in bold type was printed, warning of foreclosure within 3 weeks. Nathan had no job, no plan, only empty promises and complaints. His father's pension wasn't enough even to cover the interest on the loan, and the money his mother brought home from the store barely covered the food. They were on the brink of bankruptcy, and for the first time, I realized that nothing I could do would save them. Their home was crumbling, the way trust crumbles when it's betrayed too often. And for the first time, I understood that I couldn't fix it, not because I lacked the means or the strength, but because I was no longer obligated to make such a sacrifice for them, paying for other people's decisions with my life, my years, my heart. This thought, bitter and piercing, fell upon me with an almost physical weight, like an autumn rain that suddenly covered the city, not loudly, not stormily, but with that hopeless softness from which you can't escape. I left the house, feeling the weight of their despair, clinging to me like fog to the branches of an old garden. Their footsteps echoed dully in the evening silence, and I knew, from this moment on, nothing would ever be the same. Back in my apartment, where the silence now felt like a refuge rather than an emptiness, I stared at the screen for a long time, playing the recording of Beatrice's confession over and over again. The only thing I still had left as leverage, the last thread connecting me to a past I barely recognized as my own anymore. I sent it to the investigators, not out of vengeance, but because justice is sometimes all that remains when love is exhausted. I hoped it would help them with their investigation, but I knew it wouldn't bring back the money or the house. Everything that had been crumbling for years had finally crumbled to dust, and my family had fallen apart not only because of Beatrice's betrayal, but also because for so many years they had taken me for granted, as something self-evident, like the air they don't notice until they're suffocating. I built a new life, slowly, step by step, mornings with a strong cup of coffee, evenings with the determination to never give up. Now I had my own space and my own choices, and I wasn't going to be the one carrying them all on my shoulders again, like a stubborn atlas, oblivious to the way my bones creaked under the weight of other people's hopes. 6 months later, I was sitting with Alicia in my new apartment, a room that smelled of lavender and freshly read pages, where sunlight poured generously through the sheer curtains, scattering golden streaks across the floor. We drank wine from delicate glasses, and in this simple, almost mundane scene there was a fullness of life I had never even dared to dream of. My desk was littered with drawings for a new project at work. I was designing a bridge, and this bridge brought me not only a promotion to lead engineer but also a feeling of being in control of my direction, my destiny. Once again, thanks to the raise, I furnished my apartment with a new coffee table and bookshelf, which I once dreamed of, in a completely different time, when I didn't believe I could afford my dreams. Alicia, no longer just a friend but someone I trusted, raised her glass, her eyes laughing, her voice warm as a summer evening. "For you, Luna," she said, smiling broadly. "You're simply amazing." I laughed, easily, freely, in a way I hadn't laughed in years, feeling something inside finally straighten out, stop shaking. My life was my own now. I went to yoga twice a week. On Thursdays Alicia and I would have homemade pasta dinners and talk until midnight, and in the mornings I woke up feeling like I owed nothing to anyone but myself. I was happy not because everything was perfect, but because I had now chosen it. But the past was still lingering nearby. I learned from a mutual friend that my family had lost their home. The bank had foreclosed on it after they'd fallen behind on their bills for too long, and now they were huddled in a cramped rented apartment in the suburbs, living a life where every day was a struggle for breath. Nathan was working part-time at a hardware store, barely making ends meet. His confidence, once so clear and self-assured, had vanished like smoke, leaving only a shadow of a man calling friends at night in despair. Dad was driving for a delivery service. Mom was cleaning houses, trying to cling to some shred of her former dignity. The debts Beatrice had left behind were dragging them down, and there was no savings to soften the blow. They were surviving, but their lives had been turned upside down by their own choices. I hadn't spoken to them since that last visit, Nathan wrote, asking for money, for a place to live, but I didn't answer. My father left voicemails, his voice had softened, no longer the authoritative tone he'd once used to speak to me as a child, but I couldn't bring myself to call back. My mother once sent a letter full of apologies and regrets, but it lay unopened on my desk, like a seal of a past I no longer wanted to let into the house. For years, I bore their burden, only to be pushed away. When I needed them most, breaking with them wasn't easy, but it was necessary, like a surgical incision that hurts but saves. I learned to value my self-respect above their expectations, learned to build boundaries that protect my peace, my light. Looking back, I understood the lesson clearly. Family isn't just blood and a last name, it's those who see you, who respect you, who extend a hand without asking for anything in return. Alicia became exactly that person for me, a friend who came not to destroy, but to be there when it matters most. My family chose Beatrice's lies over my warnings, and I paid for their blindness, but in leaving, I gained something far more powerful, my own worth. Boundaries aren't walls to isolate ourselves, but shields to protect our hearts, our time, and our lives. And if you're listening to this story, I want to thank you for standing with me through betrayals, choices, and redemption. It's hard to draw the line with those you love, but sometimes it's the only way to save yourself. Have you ever had to set boundaries with your family? What did it teach you? Share your stories. Let's talk honestly, without embellishment, about what it means to stand up for yourself, even when it hurts.